What will gray zone America look like 5 to 10 years from now? That's what we're covering in this session of the Gray Zone Summit. We have Mike Shelby, and then we also have two guys from the Forward Observer Intel team. We got Dustin Mascorro, and we have Max Morton joining us today. So Mike, guide us in. When we look at what is America going to look like, what is Gray Zone America going to look like in 5 to 10 years, what are the big questions that we're asking?
What are foreign powers going to be doing to the United States in terms of actions below the threshold of armed conflict? So this is gray zone warfare, and I can't think of two better people to talk about this. We have Dustin, who's a former Army PSYOP guy, and we have Max, who has a very long career, and maybe he can opine on that later. So what I really want to talk about is what are things that are happening right now that that foreign countries are doing to the United States below the threshold of armed conflict. And Max, I'll give you the floor. And if you want to introduce yourself and let people know a little bit about your background, that would be great too.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. I'm Max Morton. I'm a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel. I spent 20 years in the Marine Corps and 10 years after that at the Central Intelligence Agency as a paramilitary operations officer. So I've operated on just about every continent except for Antarctica. And while I don't call myself an expert in every region, I have spent a lot of time there and interacted with folks. And, I will share my observations from my experience with you today. And if you have any questions that I can answer, feel free and shoot them at me. As far as what I think America is going to look like in 5 to 10 years in the gray zone, I think we're going to get into an increasing balkanization situation where just like in the Balkans in the 90s, different political and ethnic factions separated themselves from each other voluntarily or by force. And I think we'll end up with some mostly red and mostly blue areas, and with a little bit of civil unrest that has the potential to be sponsored by our peer adversaries such as China. But not only China. I mean, if you look at or listen to Sean McBate's talk on durable disorder and the future of warfare, one of the things that he brings up is that there will be wars that don't involve nation states or state actors. So in this case, if America continues to dissolve into the region of civil unrest and balkanization, you can expect activities or unconventional warfare and political warfare activities, not just from peer adversaries, but also from interested multinational parties, what are commonly referred to as the globalist oligarchy. People with money will have the ability to leverage mercenaries and private intelligence agencies to conduct information operations or to use proxy forces such as Antifa or BLM or militias on the other side of the political spectrum in order to facilitate unrest, which may support their long-term financial and business objectives, inside the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on this topic of durable disorder, this is a fairly new concept for me, but it's Sean McFate has a book called The New Rules of War, which is very interesting. Durable disorder means that there will be persistent dysfunction. Things will break and they will not be fixed. And that's he's talking about in terms of the global order of how things have been done in the past versus how things are happening now and will happen in the future. Dustin, along those lines of durable disorder, as we see foreign countries increasingly take target at the United States below the threshold of armed conflict, what do you see those foreign actors doing inside the United States right now?
So right now, it appears that it's largely we're seeing kind of this growing effort in the information operations space. I know we were talking before the show that we don't want to talk about 2016, and I guess fortunately, or depending on what your perspective is, we have seen an increase in contemporary examples up to and including even today. There was a release based on an analysis of some things that Belarus had been doing in the information environment. It was a program called Ghostwriter, which has been associated with anti-NATO activities, particularly. So, not directly a U.S. example. There is a broader effort internationally by China, Russia, Belarus, and the Iranians to a limited extent to indict the idea of U.S. leadership in the information space by discrediting U.S. institutions historically, by creating vast bot networks which serve to propagate content and functionally manipulate algorithms to show that there's an outsized impact or share of voice for a particular topic or idea. And it's very easy to write those things off. There's other political commentators who brag that 160 million user engagements on Facebook doesn't really matter, but that assumes that the audience who is consuming that information is not ideologically vulnerable to whatever the argument may be, or at least accessible, in that they're on a social media platform or a particular internet website for a large amount of time. And that can, regardless of how smart a certain individual thinks they may be, that will begin to erode at your critical thinking ability, your ability to objectively analyze information and see what the truth of the matter is, rather than become victim to an ongoing information or psychological operations activity. So I think the largest foreign effort in the United States right now is to bring up issues of race in particular. That's been a very effective line of effort for influence operators. And then additional criticism of the validity or relevancy of U.S. institutions. That's everything from local elections all the way up to the Supreme Court, what the size and composition of the courts are, and nearly everything in between. The unique thing about these psychological operations or influence activities is that there's no limit to the level of targeting that a foreign actor could engage in. So it could be a key decision maker or personality inside of a government office, all the way down to a local voting bloc that could sway an election one particular way or another. So that's kind of what I see as the main efforts right now. Mm-hmm. Racial politics remains a key talking point, and that's of course supported by domestic media actors as well, and a sympathetic political movement on the far left.
Yeah. So what you're saying, just to sum up, is social media is an attack vector for taking a small idea and propagating it, making it look like a much bigger idea, like it's a much more popular idea, and pushing that onto a target audience. And the goal of that is to sway the opinion or to modify the behavior, in many cases to agitate the target audience into some kind of action. So I'm gravely concerned about what the presidential elections of 2024 and 28 look like, now that we have had these concept of operations or proof of concept happen in 2016 and 2020. Max, I'll turn to you. There's kind of a generalized opinion sway, but how might foreign actors support domestic groups such as Antifa on the left, or militias, or far right groups in order to let me ask you, what is their objective by doing this, and then what does that support? What might that support look like in the future?
Okay. Fortunately, we have some examples from back in the 60s and 70s when the Soviet Union supported a number of political anti-war movements and anti-nuclear weapons peace movements, both in the United States and in Europe. So these were the Weather Underground, the Weathermen, the Symbionese Liberation Army, the Students for Democratic Society. All of these groups were not totally funded, but partially funded by cutouts where the money originated in the Soviet Union and worked its way through a variety of different organizations in order to foment dissent and anti-war protests within the U.S. to undermine the U.S. government. So you could see the same type of structure in the United States with groups like Antifa or BLM. And in fact, Antifa and BLM both receive money from groups that are associated with, Chinese entities that are themselves associated with the PLA and the MSS. So I think what you're seeing right now is the information operations part of this. What's the goal? The goal is to convince Americans that their way of government is broken, their leaders are ineffective and can't be trusted, and that just right around the corner, if you just go with, the propaganda, you can find, freedom and happiness and everything that you've ever wanted in a society. And we all know that's false, but the more that message is kind of delivered to, the middle class, the working class, the people who are down and out, who've lost their jobs and are involved in this internal political conflict, the more that message is going to take hold. So I think that's their objective right now. They're basically doing, instead of intelligence preparation in the battlefield, they're doing operational preparation in the battlefield by setting up these groups and then getting that message out into the minds of various political factions via social media, via news media, and via influencers that are directly or indirectly funded by these foreign actors.
Question for you, Max. How can the average American tell if anything they're seeing online is what you're describing or is just something that's benign and not actually the action of a state actor?
That's really difficult, because once the message gets distributed, it can be redistributed and regurgitated and pushed forward by both witting and unwitting actors. So they're going to try and align the message as closely as they can to, the way, culturally, the way we think and the history of our politics. Their end state is to have us lose confidence in our system of governance and our leadership. So I think the thing you have to ask when you're looking at something on social media or you're hearing it from even mainstream media personalities is, who benefits from this? Who benefits from this news report that is on its face seems obviously incorrect, or from the Facebook post or the Twitter post where it's like, this seems odd. I think one of the things that I try and do is I look at the number of bot type followers and low account, troll followers that are generally paid or supported by, think tanks or NGOs here within the US. And I kind of try and see what the percentage of those type of commenters are, or reposters, or, accounts are under a certain, post, to determine, where that post is hitting and where it's coming from. So if I'm looking at a retweet from an MSM person, and 80% of those commenters or people who retweet that post are low account followers, look like bots, have a bot type history, then I know, hey, this is probably some type of information operation. If I'm seeing a lot of named personalities, people who have a lot of credibility and some background in discussing the truth and discussing facts, then that has a little bit more credibility. But for the average person out there, if you're just surfing Twitter, you're surfing Facebook or Instagram or whatever, it's going to be very difficult to see that. You're going to have to take the time to really investigate, the cui bono part of what you're seeing on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really the U.S. government's doing a pretty darn good job of delegitimizing itself as well, which really makes Russia and China's efforts a lot easier. Dustin, you've talked about the Internet Research Agency and other various Russian propaganda outlets, very active on social media. What are some trends that you're seeing in how they are targeting the American audience on social media?
So the interesting thing about some of the overseas activity that we're seeing in our domestic information environment, that's everything you consume from news media all the way down to personal interactions like Max was talking about. And those are great recommendations, by the way, for how to determine kind of a quality score for an account to determine whether or not it's a bot. So beginning first with like the structural side of media organizations, we're seeing a lot of influence operations occurring through advertising dollars. The Chinese in particular have been spending millions and millions of dollars with domestic media outlets like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others, again, before the print version was canceled. So we see it occurring there. That, of course, involves personal relationships and building those networks between foreign military actors or foreign intelligence types who have an interest in psychological operations, as well as sympathetic or at least cash-hungry domestic media publications. Then on the online side, what we see is a lot of parroting or propagating of messages from like these low quality accounts, and that really serves to manipulate in a very forceful and direct way what the average person is seeing online. The lines of effort that have been executed against our domestic information environment have been fairly consistent over the last few years. Really, it seems in about 2014, after the post-Occupy Wall Street movement, that kind of fizzled out and didn't spark some sort of workers' revolution here in the United States to fundamentally change our monetary system. But we did find greater inroads in the society made through exploitation of racial politics, the discrediting of our involvement in international bodies. It's been a popular talking point on the political right for a number of years, and some of this has been prompted by foreign actors to divest from overseas projects, any of the State Department type funds that go to building wells all over the world, like those types of things. And that is typically targeted by information actors in order to foment dissent inside of the United States and get not only constituents at the local level, but also, of course, politicians at whatever level of government to begin to publicly criticize those items. There's a couple of interesting case study examples that we see over in Europe. It has a lot to do with historical figures. Now, this began in 2015 or 2014, 2015, and it was targeting historical figures in Lithuania for their supposed or having some complicity in working with the German and the Nazis in particular during World War II. And while these people may have been folk heroes at one point in time in the history of those nations by planting stories, and I mean, the Soviets did this for decades, but the Russians continue to do it today. They would plant stories in local blogs, small social media outlets, or whatever their analogous equivalent was at the time, and then get that picked up by a sympathetic Western media outlet, and then the story can, of course, go on from there, and then is given way more legitimacy and credibility once major media institutions in the West begin to talk about the same things. But oftentimes we find that these are either ghost-written articles by influence operations professionals, or simply a bag of cash is exchanged somewhere along the way in order to portray historical events in a certain light. In modern times, we're seeing this. It really got out of control between 2018 and 2020 with the mass removal of many historical statues, monuments of historical figures in the United States. And a lot of times the argument that was made was that it was due to racism, institutional racism, or suppression of minorities, whatever the case happened to be. And that's really where we see the continued efforts they're ongoing. Kind of a unique feature of the American society is that because we do have free speech, that can oftentimes be exploited by malign actors. There's really no limit on what you can say as long as it's not a verbal communicated threat, and that's used to influence susceptible audiences, young people in particular, and really degrade their faith in the idea of America or the legitimacy of the American experiment going forward. And I think that that's going to be a major issue we're going to have to contend with, and it goes to Max's point earlier of this balkanization that seems to be cropping up across the United States, at least in some form or fashion, with where folks are relocating to.
Yeah, historically, I mean, that's a strong case for balkanization, especially when you look at collapsed empires. The governance of the empire, or the the governing structure of the empire may melt away, but the people remain, and they're subsumed into another empire. Maybe they rise up and create their own new governing structures. And so I think the case for balkanization for the United States is quite strong, especially given geographic cultural differences from, say Massachusetts to, the Southeast, the heart of Dixie, the voting preferences and so on. Max, over to you. One of the things that Dustin has brought up several times now is former CIA Director Mike Pompeo and also former Secretary of State. Pompeo said that the Chinese are more and more active in not just in national level issues, but now getting into state government, wielding cash and influence at the state level and even down into the municipal and city level. So what are some of your concerns as we see, especially the Chinese, start to flex more power at the local level in the context of balkanization? What are your concerns for that?
Well, I think we have to be concerned because that's, the local and state level is where our politics starts. I mean, too often in America, we've gotten lazy in the past and we've focused on, the presidential elections or even the congressional elections, every 2 to 4 years. And we've taken our eye off the ball when it comes to, our county supervisors, our local sheriffs, our state legislators. And what we saw in the last election in 2020 was the state legislators really had a big part to play in the electoral process, which some people think was, corrupted. But at a minimum, I mean, what we saw was state legislatures failed to control the voting laws that were their responsibility and under their constitutional authority. And so I think what you're going to see, or what you are seeing now, is Chinese money entering through universities and colleges, academic institutions, and then that being used as a driver for messaging to get out and to do certain things or allow certain things, like we saw in 2020 with the mail-in voting, done by diktat or done by a judge, but not approved by the state legislature, essentially unconstitutional. That's where the Chinese are moving. So if you look at how they look at things, it is with their unrestricted warfare doctrine, is they don't necessarily need to control the United States by occupation. They don't need to control the sword of the U.S. military. They don't, or our state and local government. They just need to control the hand that controls the weapon. And so that's what you're seeing here as they start to push their influence operations, their money, in their political warfare operations down into the state and local level. Also, an incredible amount of property, real estate, farmland is being bought up by the Chinese and used in big agribusiness. And this is an important role in rural areas because there's a lot of influence, a lot of money. There are jobs that go into that big agriculture that are important to the local population and also the local politicians. So they're gaining that influence because they're controlling something that politician needs. And of course, there's always the dark money trail for a lot of these state and local politicians who aren't raking in tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for their campaigns. So that's where I see a lot of the problem with Chinese operations inside the United States right now. Now that can significantly change with increased civil unrest. It can change not just in quantity, but also in MO that they use to further that unrest or that divide between the rich and poor, the left and right, the black and white, whatever you want to do. It's right now, I think it's confined to buying influence and getting the right people in office to allow them to pursue their further objectives.
Mm-hmm. let's stay on this topic of Chinese influence at the state level, because there's a bill sitting in Congress right now, and we reported on this back on the 2nd of November. And this bill is called the City and State Diplomacy Act, and you have a handful of, actually led by Representative Ted Lieu, a Democrat from California. You have a handful of Republican and Democrats pushing this bill because they want mayors and governors to become diplomatic assets. And so what they're doing is trying to build stronger bonds between mayors and governors and their foreign counterparts, either at the national or the provincial or city level. And one of the things we noted is that this is going to invite foreign actors into cities and into state levels, because now they're talking about making a office of city and state diplomacy, and we may actually eventually see an office of foreign diplomacy at the city and state level. And so that's a concern of mine in particular. Dustin, you're a politics guy, especially on the PR side. What are some concerns you have as far as increased access to politicians from foreign counterparts who may actually be intelligence assets?
So but in a previous life, I was actually a lobbyist for this exact issue. I took a very middle of the road approach to it. But there is a concerted effort by major lobbyist outfits out there in the world to develop closer ties and do essentially what amounts to foreign direct investment in U.S. communities from anywhere in the world. Now, this particular group was more focused on using the U.S. Trade and Development Agency as kind of the funneling mechanism by which a local business would be able to do business overseas or bring workers over and have some sort of exchange from that standpoint. But to push it down to the local level and make it the state's responsibility to interact with foreign governments not only brings up some authorities issues, but of course the concerns with bribery. There's a lot of diplomatic loopholes that can be exploited whenever you're dealing directly with representatives from a foreign government or intelligence services who are supposing to represent a particular business which may want to operate in the United States or build a factory, whatever the case may be. China is the major concern, especially as we continue to see around $600 billion a year in theft of intellectual property. If you can remove the federal government from any sort of its oversight functions, in addition to leveraging the multitude of intelligence assets that we have at our disposal at the national level to be able to determine these individual actors and potential ties to foreign intelligence services, states don't have the capacity to do that. We were talking about on that particular show about it would come down to the State Bureau of Investigations, and many of them not only don't have the technical capacity nor the budget to develop a technical capacity to pick apart these networks, but they simply don't have the bandwidth in many instances. It would be a multi-year effort across all 50 states in order to establish these things, which it doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it highly unlikely that a particular state, certain states may be more sophisticated. Like, you think California, they have access to a lot of resources and funds through tax revenue, whatever. But they, what does that say about New Mexico? And so we would see a really uneven playing field across the United States, which would kind of give a lot of foreign nations the ability to pick winners and losers as far as their distribution of their investments, both legitimate and illegitimate. Exchanging bags of cash in an airport hangar is like the most fantastical example, I guess. But separate from just the bribery issues, there's also concerns over blackmail, the ability of these local politicians at whatever level of non-national governance, their ability to be blackmailed by individuals either through unethical business practices or impropriety in their personal life, which we've seen impact some national politicians. But I think given the opportunities that would present themselves at the local level, it would be an absolute nightmare scenario, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Staying on this track, Max, you brought up balkanization earlier. Do you think does that play into China's favor? What's your take on how China views the potential for balkanization for the United States, and how are some ways that they might try to further that in the future? Oh, I think you're still on mute there.
I'm kind of torn between whether I think balkanization supports or inhibits China's influence operations here in the U.S. It kind of depends on the resources that individual red states have to push back on it, as Dustin was talking about. Because I think one of the big things that we've seen, at least in the last decade, is the FBI is not as effective in the counterintelligence role against Chinese actors as they probably could be. And I think some of that is because a lot of these Chinese actors are connected at the hip through investment in business activities with senior politicians and business leaders within the U.S. So there may be a hesitancy to really chase these guys down hard. If I put myself in the shoes of somebody at the MSS who's looking to exploit the situation in the U.S., if we're balkanized and all the different entities, the states, the red states, the blue states, are extremely weak and they're susceptible to, influence operations, bribery, corruption, things like that, then that's good. But if the governors or state leaders or caucuses or however this ends up balkanizing out are strong and they're aware of this problem, and they use very strong and effective measures to prevent Chinese investment from gaining a foothold, then it obviously, balkanization is the last thing they want. If China can control a lot of federal government officials or have influence over them, then they're going to want to keep things as centralized as possible to facilitate, their kind of single point of operations thing. Excuse me. One thing I want to bring up, and what Dustin was saying about the corruption and the ability to bribe local officials, that's happening right now in the South China Sea and the Pacific Rim. China is moving into the first and second island chains, into a lot of these small nation states, and they're coming in not just with official government activities, but they're coming in with investments and commercial activities that then allow a foothold for criminal networks that then end up corrupting that particular society. And Cleo Pascal at the Chatham House spoke about this at a Homeland Security Pacific region hearing a couple of weeks ago. And she just flat out said, listen, Belt and Road Initiative comes in and they basically co-opt the government through debt. And then they also bring in commercial activities, which bring in prostitution, gambling, drug smuggling, things like that, which undermines the social network. And they end up flipping these small nation states like the Solomon Islands. So we're seeing that right now, like in the Pacific, that model, that unrestricted warfare model. To say that it would not be at least attempted onto a balkanized America, I can't see how it wouldn't be. From their perspective, why would they not use that same effective model that they already have practice with against us in that condition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brian, did you have a question?
I'm curious what an individual can do about this. Both, how do we know that what we're seeing fits what you're saying? How can we identify? But then what actual action can a person take?
Yeah, Dustin, let's start with you. From looking at an individual's relatively limited circle of influence and really where their concern should be at the local level, what can an individual do, given that we are going to have a period of durable disorder in this country, where I think the United States is probably going to much more resemble certain governments in Latin America. So on the information side, what can a person do?
I think a lot of it comes down to limiting your exposure to confirmation bias information, like information that you just are seeking out that reaffirms your existing worldview. A lot of times can leave you very vulnerable to influence activities. unfortunately, the way a lot of social media and largely the internet is constructed these days is designed to create almost a self-licking ice cream cone of information, wherein you're only going to see information from people that you interact the most with, and that can be either a high-quality account, such as a friend or family member, or a trusted public figure, all the way down to anonymous bot accounts. Many of the meme pages out there in the world, maybe run by 15 or 20 individuals, not necessarily based here in the United States. And so it's looking at the world with a more critical eye. It's educating yourself, becoming media literate, if you will, understanding that if you're reading a piece of information on a social media platform, okay, why did you see that when you saw it? If it's something about an upcoming Civil War II scenario, and then 3 posts later you see advertisements for body armor and food buckets, well, that's a perfect example of an algorithm manipulating the types of information that you see in order to push you to a particular behavior, action or inaction, or changing your belief in some way. I think that's what an individual can do, is just look at the world with a critical eye. If a product is free, you are the product. Ultimately, they're selling your information for exploitation and targeting, not only by political actors, but also just the business community, like we've seen. I just used an example with the food buckets and body armor. But so at an individual level, that's what you can do. It's having open and honest discussions, things that engage with information and media which challenges your worldview, and that will create a more critical mind, or at least that's the intent. Will create a more critical mind in the individual, so that whenever you are presented with something that doesn't seem to pass the smell test, it's like, okay, well, do I just take it at face value, or do a little more investigation? And a lot of people, frankly, the data shows it, that they're not willing to do that. Folks often just seem to want to have their existing opinions reconfirmed. They don't like to be challenged. It's really no secret. But that's what an individual can do. And the other component to that is getting involved in your local community, actually understanding what's happening in your backyard. If there are ballot initiatives that you don't understand, well, you might want to learn about it and go out and show up whenever it's time to up or down vote a particular initiative, city council races, school boards. And we're kind of seeing a resurgence in that because, like we talked about earlier, folks really recognize that, sure, you can have national victories in politics, but if your local district attorney or secretary of state or whatever state and local office isn't willing to do their job, that you can have an absolute collapse of a local society, which can ripple out from there, of course.
Yeah, Dustin, thanks. That was actually my next question for Max. In 2017, I think the Soros crew started putting in, I think they put in like $20 million into district attorney races, or at least races at the local level. Max, you talk a lot about organizing, about political organizing. What's some advice that you would give a viewer, knowing what we are probably going to inherit in the future, some of which we're already seeing now? What's your best advice to someone on the local level to organize against these kinds of things affecting us directly at the local level?
Mike, that was exactly what I was going to bring up in response to Dustin's comments, is that, one of the key things that individuals can do is organize in their local communities. And I don't mean on social media and, working with people, 3, 4, 5 states away, but locally in their county, in their city, in the, different regions of their states, and develop a grassroots movement. And that grassroots movement is not just for you to, or for the movement to be able to select political leaders and hold them accountable. But it's also to understand with more detail on what is going on in their community, what initiatives are, like Ted Lieu's initiative to bring state and local officials into the international diplomatic arena. That, let's be honest, what Ted Lieu is advocating for is the ability for the Chinese to spot and assess future targets that they can develop and recruit for both intelligence purposes and influence operations as access agents. So, if you're living in a county in Nebraska somewhere and you have your grassroots movement, and you should be researching what what external initiatives are putting money into the local community, into businesses and into politicians. And if you start to see something like this, then you need to put a stop to it. That's the power of organizing. It's not one person out there doing hours and hours and hours of research. It's 100 or 1,000 or 2,000 people in your community, all with a like-minded agenda that know what to look out for, and they can spend the little bit of time they don't have, at work and running kids around to soccer games and stuff. They can spend all spend a little bit of time working on, that kind of citizen oversight.
Yeah, I feel like that's a strategic advantage that has atrophied for many on the local level. Brian, you wanted to talk about your experience with organizing?
Yeah, or being disorganized, perhaps. There was a law passed in Washington State, where I live, back in 2018, Initiative 1639, that banned individuals selling guns to each other unless they go through an FFL. Now, quite apart from how anyone feels about that particular law, I'm going to read the stats here. $4.6 million was donated to pass this law. $1.2 million from Paul Allen, $1.2 million from Nick Hanauer, $1 million from Ballmer. So 3 people were able to outbid everybody else, and almost all the money came from these groups. Now, this particular list doesn't show that there was also some money from the Every Time for Gun Safety group as well. So we had this huge money coming from outside our state, and then that bought so many ads, and it's not like we were all in one direction anyways, but it definitely swayed it to where there's no way the people who thought the gun sales were okay could possibly outspend the Microsoft millionaires. So when we talk about the influence of other nations into here, like, it's happening here. It's happened here past tense, where money from outside our region controlled the complete public discourse. And I'm really curious from all 3 of you. Okay, so organize, pay attention to local ballots, yes. This particular risk of huge amounts of cash coming from outside, control the narrative. What can we do to fight back against that?
Yeah, we see that especially in Senate races too, where money pours in all over the country, like this Beto, Robert Francis O'Rourke and Ted Cruz race this last cycle. Why is money from California pouring into Texas? And Republicans do this too. Max, we'll start with you and pitch this question to Dustin. What can we feasibly do to not just prevent outsized impact from foreign interests, foreign including outside of your state or your locale, but also Chinese money pouring into your area, changing the laws that will benefit them? What can we do?
Well, and that's a good question, because money talks, and money is a huge vulnerability when it comes to, nefarious activities, recruiting people, politicians to do your bidding. Money is normally the key, but it only works if it can be passed around unseen. So the 2 examples I want to bring up. One is Bloomberg. His presidential run, he spent like $350 million, or billions of dollars. I can't remember exactly the total amount he spent, but it was an insane amount of money. But he was exposed. He was exposed by the alt or non-legacy media, and as running around and just basically handing out cash, and it discredited him. And I don't think he ever got more than 1% in the polls, and he wasted that money. So I think at the local level, when you see a lot of, first off, you have to have some type of grassroots movement that can identify the fact that money is coming in to, flip, the district attorney's seat, to flip your sheriff, to flip the county supervisor or the mayor or whatever. You got to be able to identify that that's happening. And then you need to expose it and ruthlessly expose it. And the other example I want to bring up is Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. Kelly and his wife have a small foothold in Tucson, which is a very blue city in Arizona. And he was able to gain that seat partially because he has a lot of Chinese money associated with him, and a lot of investment or co-investors in his businesses are associated with the Chinese government. That money came in, propelled him into a position where he won that Senate seat. But the people in Tucson and Southern Arizona did a good job of exposing the amount of Chinese money that he was associated with. And that kind of tainted him. Even though he did win the Senate seat, he is still fighting a reputation of being somebody who's a recipient of foreign, aid from a potential peer adversary. And I think they're going to use that effectively against him in the coming election, because he was elected into a seat that was vacated, I think, by Senator Kyle on a temporary basis. So he's coming up for re-election. But that's still haunting him. And that's what you have to do, is you have to expose it. You're not going to be able to fight dollar per dollar with somebody like George Soros or, the Chinese security service, using cutouts to pump money in there. But you can make those people unattractive culturally in your area by continually to expose them, to mock them, to just destroy them on social media, so that every time somebody hears the name Mark Kelly or Bloomberg or whatever, that they don't associate that with an American who's looking out for their best interests. They associate that with some guy who's taking money from the wrong kind of people. I think right now that's the best you can do. That and putting quality candidates up against them that don't have those same kind of vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite concerning, considering that all the things that the United States has done abroad for the past 50 years is now knocking on our front door. Dustin, next, same question to you. What's your advice on what we can do on the local level to push back against, either foreign or domestic influence operations, especially targeting politics?
So exposure is the best medicine here for this. The United States has a history going all the way back to the early 1980s with the Active Measures Working Group, where we would analyze propaganda or investments from overseas that were suspicious, false narratives, disinformation, things like that. And then they would sit down on the nightly news programs, a representative from this particular working group, and they would sit there and discuss exactly what those issues are. What that looks like at the local level, that means if you discover there's a foreign investment behind a particular candidate, or like with the recent change to Federal Election Commission rules regarding foreign investment for like issues advocacy. This is dealing with a mining case up in Montana, that now allows for, at the national level, if anytime there's an issue in a local community, foreign governments can invest money in the PR efforts to change that election. And that means it's incumbent on the candidate, those who support the candidate, who discover this information, whoever is the person who finds this stuff out, go on your local radio, talk to congregations, you talk to school board meetings, you go to city council meetings and hearings, so that these conversations are read into the public record and can be broadcast and rebroadcast for everyone who has an interest in this issue. Exposure is the best thing. Like Max said, you're not going to be able to match these folks dollar for dollar, because it's not the responsibility of the individual citizen to try and financially compete with the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians, but it is incumbent on the citizen to be involved in their local community and understand all the factors and facets at play. And that just takes work and investment of time, not necessarily cash.
Well, folks, we covered a lot of stuff in this session on what a gray zone America in the future looks like, what the information world looks like right now. And Mike, your shop puts out a tool to help people be better prepared to go deal with this. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, which one on
all of
training?
No. Well, I'm thinking about your situational awareness, where you have your Intel team, two of whom are here with you, and they go sift through the vast amounts of data, a lot of which is crap, to go deliver that which is actionable and relevant to individuals. You like to say 60% of your attention should be local, 30% state, 10% national, and you have an Intel team that delivers that national and global. So that ability to ignore all the crap that's out there and only hear the actionable, important stuff, I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, so we're getting ready to make some changes, but we produce daily Intel reports on all the things that we've talked about here and a lot more. one of the things I learned a lot from reading Dustin's and Max's reports as well. And we exist to reduce uncertainty about the future because we're trying to figure this out for ourselves. I want to know what the United States of America is going to look like in another 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years. And that's what we work at every single day, is uncovering what's behind the curtain, putting the puzzle pieces together to figure this out. Because once we understand, once you have an accurate expectations of the future, then we can begin to be very deliberate and very specific about how we plan for that. And just in summation, there are a lot of things that we can do on the national and global level. The thing that we can't do is analyze your local level. And then really that is incumbent upon you. And just to echo Max and Dustin, it takes organizing. I talk a lot about counterinsurgency, and the very first phase, traditionally the very first phase is organizing. That's what insurgents do. And the way to stop insurgents from organizing is to counter-organize the populace against them. And that's applicable in this situation as well.
Okay, folks, that's it for this session. We'll see you on the next live session here in a few